The order left Vorthane High Command at 3:47 station time, carrying an authentication code that would have been honored, without question, by every vessel in the Ninth Border Fleet, a strike command that would have opened fire on an unarmed human colonial convoy of 11,000 civilians within 4 minutes of receipt. It never reached those ships. It reached, instead, a single overworked signals officer named Chief Petty Officer Talia Reyes, sitting alone in the quiet hours of an overnight watch aboard a relay station. Neither government fully trusted, and both governments, for reasons neither had ever fully examined, had somehow agreed to keep operating anyway. What she did in the 11 minutes that followed determined whether two civilizations already exhausted by one war were about to stumble into a second, far worse one, over a mistake that took less than 4 minutes to make, and very nearly cost 11,000 lives before anyone with the authority to stop it even knew a mistake had been made. Relay Station Kestrel existed because of a clause nobody on either side of the Vorthang Compact ceasefire had expected to matter much when the treaty negotiators wrote it into the final settlement 9 years earlier. The Threshold Accords, signed in the exhausted aftermath of a 3-year border war that had cost both civilizations tens of thousands of lives without producing a decisive outcome for either side, contained, buried among far more prominent provisions governing territorial boundaries and prisoner exchanges, a single technical clause requiring that all military communications crossing the newly established demilitarized border corridor route through a jointly staffed, jointly monitored relay facility. A provision inserted at the insistence of a mid-level compact negotiator who had argued, against considerable skepticism from more senior colleagues, that a shared communications chokepoint would give both sides an early warning mechanism against exactly the kind of catastrophic misunderstanding that had, in fact, started the war in the first place. The clause had been treated, for most of the 9 years since, as a minor administrative footnote rather than a meaningful strategic safeguard. Relay Station Kestrel operated with a skeleton crew, roughly 40 personnel, split evenly between Compact and Vorthane Signals staff, working in a facility that both governments funded with a reluctance bordering on resentment, viewing the joint relay requirement less as a genuine confidence-building measure and more as an inconvenient bureaucratic obligation, left over from a peace negotiated under duress rather than any real mutual trust. The mid-level compact negotiator who had originally insisted on the relay clause, a career diplomat named Ambassador Corwin Ake, had by the time of the incident long since retired from active service, watching the institution he had fought so hard to include in the Accords gradually fade into the kind of overlooked administrative footnote he had specifically designed it to prevent. He would later say, in a brief statement issued after the incident became public, that he had felt a complicated mixture of vindication and profound unease reading the inquiry's initial findings. Vindication that the mechanism he had once argued for against considerable skepticism had, in the end, functioned exactly as intended, and unease at how narrowly it had succeeded, given how thoroughly both governments had, in the intervening years, allowed the safeguard to be treated as little more than a formality. I designed that clause because I did not trust either government, including my own, to remain vigilant forever, Ake wrote. I take no pleasure in being proven right about that particular pessimism, only a very great relief that the officers actually staffing the station on the night it mattered took their duty more seriously than either government in practice had been asking them to. Officers assigned to Kestrel understood, almost universally, that the posting was considered a career backwater, a rotation given to signals specialists whose superiors had run out of more interesting places to put them, and the station's daily routine, for most of its 9 years of operation, had consisted of exactly the kind of tedious, unglamorous traffic monitoring that justified that reputation. Routine logistics communications, scheduled diplomatic exchanges, and the occasional minor procedural dispute over whose watch crew had failed to properly log a maintenance request. The station itself, a modest orbital facility positioned at the exact geometric midpoint of the demilitarized corridor, had been constructed using surplus components from both militaries' decommissioned wartime infrastructure, a detail that struck several officers who served there over the years, Talia among them, as a fitting if unplanned symbol of the peace it was meant to safeguard. Something functional, unglamorous, and built FR. The leftover pieces of a conflict neither side particularly wanted to remember in detail. Talia Reyes had been assigned to Kestrel for just under 3 years by the night the Vorthane strike order crossed her console, a posting she had neither requested nor particularly resented, having built, over that time, a quiet professional satisfaction out of work that most of her peers considered beneath their ambitions. She had grown up on a compact colony world called Ashgrove Reach, the daughter of 2 communications engineers who had spent their careers building and maintaining the planetary relay network connecting Ashgrove's scattered agricultural settlements, and she had absorbed, almost by osmosis, a particular philosophy about signals work that most of her fleet colleagues found faintly old-fashioned. That a communications relay was not merely a passive conduit for other people's decisions, but a genuine point of responsibility in its own right, a place where a careful, attentive operator could catch the kind of small, consequential errors that got lost entirely in systems designed to move information as quickly and invisibly as possible. Her father in particular had drilled into her, across a childhood spent trailing him through Ashgrove's aging relay infrastructure on maintenance rounds, a habit he called reading the traffic, a discipline of actually attending to the content and context of the messages passing through a relay system rather than simply confirming their successful transmission, a habit that had, on at least 2 occasions during Talia's childhood, allowed her father to catch and correct genuinely dangerous errors. Once flagging a misrouted emergency medical transport request that would otherwise have been delayed by nearly 6 critical hours, and once identifying a corrupted agricultural weather alert that, left uncorrected, would have sent an entire harvest crew directly into the path of a catastrophic storm system. She remembered with particular clarity the second of those 2 incidents, having been present herself, 11 years old at the time, riding along on what was meant to be a routine weekend maintenance circuit through one of Ashgrove's outer relay substations. Her father had paused, mid-inspection, over a weather advisory that the automated system had already logged as successfully delivered to its intended recipients. A routine storm warning that should have contained nothing more than standard, unremarkable data. He had sat with it for nearly 10 minutes, far longer than the message's apparent simplicity seemed to warrant, before finally identifying a corrupted data field that had inverted the storm system's projected direction of travel. A small technical error that, left uncorrected, would have told an entire harvest crew working the eastern fields that the storm was moving away from them when it was, in fact, moving directly toward their position. He had spent the following 90 minutes personally tracking down the crew's supervisor by radio, working through 3 separate relay stations before finally reaching someone with the authority to redirect the crew to shelter. A delay Talia remembered vividly, because she had sat beside him through the entire anxious process. Watching her father's calm, methodical persistence in the face of a problem that everyone else around him had already assumed was resolved. "The system will tell you the message went through," he had told her, more times than she could count, including that same afternoon, once the crew had finally reached safety and the immediate crisis had passed. "It will never tell you whether the message made sense. That part is still your job, and it always will be, no matter how good the automation gets." She had joined the compact Fleet Signals Corps at 22, carrying that lesson with her through 8 years of increasingly technical postings. And by the time she arrived at Kestrel, she had developed a professional reputation, modest but consistent, as an officer who read her traffic more carefully than most, a habit that had occasionally earned her a reputation among more senior colleagues as somewhat overly cautious, prone to flagging minor anomalies that usually turned out, on closer inspection, to be nothing more than routine administrative quirks in Vorthane communication, protocols that compact analysts had never fully mapped. The Vorthane Directorate, the civilization on the other side of the threshold accords, governed a fractured, multi-species confederation held together by a rigid, hierarchical military command structure that had, in the 9 years since the war's end, undergone a slow but genuine political transformation. As a generation of officers who had fought and lost the war gradually ceded influence to a younger cohort more skeptical of the confrontational, expansionist doctrine that had driven the original conflict. The war itself still referred to across both civilizations simply as the Threshold War, had begun over a resource dispute in a sparsely charted border sector that neither government had initially considered strategically significant. An escalation that both sides, in the sober retrospective analysis conducted years later, agreed had been driven less by any genuine irreconcilable conflict of interest than by a cascading series of misread signals and worst-case assumptions. Each side's defensive military buildup interpreted by the other as unmistakable evidence of offensive intent, until neither government could find a face-saving way to step back from a confrontation that mounting mutual suspicion had made feel, to both populations, increasingly inevitable. The 3 years of fighting that followed cost both civilizations enormous casualties across a series of grinding, inconclusive border engagements, and the war's eventual end came not from any decisive military victory on either side, but from a shared, mutual exhaustion that finally made the difficult, painstaking work of the Threshold Accords negotiations politically survivable for both governments. A peace built, as so many pieces are, more on depletion than on any genuine resolution of the underlying distrust that had made the war possible in the first place. That transformation, however, remained deeply contested within Vorthane High Command, and the 9th Border Fleet, the formation responsible for patrolling the demilitarized corridor closest to compact colonial space, remained, by the night of the strike order, under the command of a general named Thesic Vorn Kalath, one of the last senior officers from the pre-war generation still holding an active field command. A man whose deep and lasting distrust of the compact had survived 9 years of uneasy peace essentially intact. Kalath's career had been built, in its formative years, on the Threshold War's opening campaign, a series of engagements in which he had personally commanded the border defense that many Vorthane military historians credited with preventing an early, potentially decisive compact breakthrough. A reputation that had made him something of a celebrated figure within the more traditionalist wings of Vorthane military culture, even as the war's later. Grinding stalemate gradually eroded public enthusiasm for the conflict more broadly. He had accepted the threshold accords in the war's final months, not out of any genuine conviction that peace with the compact was desirable or durable, but out of a soldier's pragmatic recognition that his own government lacked the political will and material resources to continue prosecuting a war that had stopped producing any meaningful strategic advantage years earlier. An acceptance that had never, in the 9 years since, evolved into anything resembling genuine trust. General Kalath had spent much of the preceding month increasingly convinced, based on a series of ambiguous sensor reports from Vorthane forward patrols, that the compact was quietly preparing to violate the demilitarized corridor's colonization restrictions. Reports that Vorthane intelligence analysts, working under considerable pressure from a command structure eager for evidence confirming what it already suspected, had assembled into an increasingly alarming picture of an 11,000-person colonial convoy that Kalath's staff had come to believe, based on a badly misread trajectory analysis, was preparing an unauthorized settlement expansion directly into contested border territory, a violation that, under the Threshold Accord's own provisions, would have technically authorized a Vorthane military response. The month-long build-up to that mistaken conclusion had unfolded, in the retrospective account later reconstructed by inquiry investigators, through a series of individually minor analytical errors that compounded, over successive weekly intelligence briefings, into an increasingly confident and increasingly wrong assessment. A junior analyst's initial flagging of the convoy's unusual proximity to the boundary corridor, itself a reasonable observation given the outdated targeting software's uncorrected coordinates, had been elevated through 3 successive levels of review, each level adding its own layer of interpretive certainty, until what had begun as a single ambiguous sensor anomaly had transformed, by the time it reached General Kalath's desk in its final form, into a confident assessment that compact colonial authorities were engaged in a deliberate, calculated provocation, an assessment that fit, with an uncomfortable neatness the inquiry's authors specifically noted in their final report, the exact pattern of behavior Kalath's own pre-war experience had trained him to expect from the compact. The trajectory analysis was wrong. The convoy in question, a genuine compact colonial fleet carrying 11,000 civilians and their accumulated possessions toward a newly approved settlement world, was following a jump corridor that passed for purely geometric reasons related to the underlying structure of subspace navigation routes in that sector, close enough to the demilitarized boundary to trigger Vorthane sensor alerts, but was never, at any point in its planned journey, going to cross into contested territory at all, a fact that a more careful, less anxious analysis would have confirmed within hours rather than the increasingly urgent worst-case interpretation that Kalath's staff had instead constructed over the preceding week. General Kalath issued the strike order at 3:47 station time, authorizing the 9th Border Fleet's forward elements to intercept and destroy the convoy before it could, in his assessment, complete what he believed was an imminent and deliberately provocative violation of the demilitarized corridor's terms. Under the Threshold Accord's communications provisions, that order, like every military communication crossing the border corridor, was required to route through Relay Station Kestrel before reaching its intended recipients, a procedural formality that had, for 9 years, added nothing more than a brief, unremarkable delay to routine Vorthane military traffic, and that Kalath's own staff, filing the order through standard channels without any particular concern, had no reason to expect would function any differently this time. Talia Reyes was seated at her console when the order arrived, midway through what had, until that moment, been an entirely unremarkable overnight watch. She noticed it not because any automated system flagged it as unusual, since the order's authentication codes and formatting matched standard Vorthane military traffic precisely, but because she had, as her father had taught her, developed a habit of actually reading the content of the traffic passing through her station, rather than simply confirming its successful relay, and something in the order's specific, unusually detailed targeting coordinates. Combined with the priority classification stamped across its header, a classification she recognized from 3 years of watching Vorthane traffic pass through Kestrel, as reserved almost exclusively for genuine combat operations rather than routine patrol adjustments, made her stop and actually parse the full content of the message rather than allowing it to pass through her relay queue on its normal, largely automated timeline. The overnight watch, up until that moment, had followed its familiar, unremarkable rhythm. She had spent the preceding 3 hours processing the ordinary trickle of low-priority administrative traffic that made up the bulk of Kestrel's nighttime workload, logistics requisitions, routine patrol schedule adjustments, a handful of personal correspondence messages that both governments permitted relay staff to route for military personnel stationed along the border corridor, each one requiring nothing more than a cursory confirmation that formatting and authentication codes matched expected patterns before allowing it to proceed. She had, in the hours before the strike order arrived, been contemplating nothing more consequential than whether the station's aging coffee synthesizer would survive another maintenance cycle, a thought she would later recall with a kind of grim, disbelieving irony given what followed. What she read in the 90 seconds that followed her initial pause was an authorization to destroy a vessel designation she recognized immediately, having processed only 6 hours earlier during her previous watch rotation, the routine compact colonial traffic notifications that accompanied any major fleet movement through the sector, as belonging to the civilian colonial convoy Meridian's Promise, a designation she had specifically noted at the time because the convoy's manifest, routinely filed as part of standard cross-border transparency protocols under the Threshold Accords, listed a passenger count of just over 11,000 civilians, including, she remembered with a specific, sickening clarity, nearly 2,000 children under the age of 12. She remembered, too, a small, entirely unremarkable detail from that earlier manifest review, a note indicating that the convoy included a newly commissioned educational vessel intended to serve as the settlement's first schoolhouse, a detail that meant nothing operationally, but that surfaced, unbidden, in her mind in the same instant she processed exactly what the strike order in front of her was authorizing. She had, by her own later account, perhaps 90 more seconds to decide what to do before the order, moving through Kestrel's relay queue on its standard automated timeline, would complete its transmission to the Ninth Border Fleet's forward elements and become, in every practical sense, irreversible. Talia Reyes did not have the authority to unilaterally cancel or delay a properly authenticated Vorthane military order. Relay Station Kestrel's operating charter, negotiated as part of the original Threshold Accords, explicitly prohibited relay staff from interfering with, editing, or delaying military traffic that met standard authentication requirements, a provision both governments had insisted upon precisely to prevent the shared relay facility from being used, deliberately or otherwise, as a tool for either side to sabotage or manipulate the other's military communications. What the charter did permit, in a narrow provision that Talia had read carefully during her initial training rotation, and that most of her colleagues, in 3 years of largely routine traffic, had apparently never had occasion to actually invoke, was a mandatory verification hold. A mechanism allowing relay staff to flag a communication for confirmation of its underlying factual basis, when that communication appeared to rely on operational data that conflicted with information independently available to the relay station itself. A provision originally intended to catch simple logistical errors, misrouted coordinates, outdated fleet positions, rather than anything as consequential as what Talia now believed she was looking at. She remembered in the brief, frantic seconds before she committed to invoking it, a specific detail from her initial training rotation 3 years earlier, a senior instructor's offhand comment that the verification hold provision existed mostly as a theoretical safeguard, included in the charter to satisfy negotiators' abstract concerns about relay station authority, rather than because anyone genuinely expected it to be used in a live combat scenario. She remembered thinking at the time that the comment had struck her as slightly too dismissive of a mechanism that seemed, on paper, exactly the kind of tool a careful officer might one day genuinely need. A thought she had filed away without much further consideration, until the exact moment, 3 years later, when that theoretical safeguard became the only thing standing between an authenticated strike order and 11,000 civilian lives. She invoked it anyway, with less than 60 seconds remaining before the order's scheduled automated release, entering the verification hold code with hands that she would later admit, in the incident review that followed, had been shaking badly enough that she needed a second attempt to complete the entry correctly. The verification hold did not cancel the order. It did not even delay it indefinitely. Under Kestrel's operating protocols, a verification hold could suspend a communications automated transmission for a maximum window of 30 minutes, during which relay staff were required to attempt confirmation of the flagged discrepancy through direct contact with the originating command, after which, absent a formal cancellation from the originating authority, the communication would automatically release regardless of whether the discrepancy had been resolved. Talia had, in effect, bought herself 30 minutes to prove that General Kalath's strike order was based on a catastrophic intelligence error, with no guarantee that 30 minutes would be remotely sufficient, and with the very real possibility that her intervention, if it proved to be based on a misunderstanding of her own, would end her career and permanently damage the fragile, largely symbolic trust that had allowed Relay Station Kestrel to function at all across 9 uneasy years of peace. Her first action, in the minutes immediately following the hold, was to pull Meridian's Promise's full navigational filing from Kestrel's own independent tracking archive, a record maintained separately from Vorthane intelligence and therefore, she reasoned, immune to whatever error had corrupted General Kalath's staff's trajectory analysis. The record confirmed exactly what she had remembered. The convoy's planned route, while passing near enough to the demilitarized boundary to explain why Vorthane sensors had flagged it for attention, never crossed into contested territory at any point along its full projected course. A discrepancy of roughly 40 kilometers between the convoy's actual closest approach to the boundary and the point Vorthane's own targeting data apparently placed it, a gap that Talia suspected, correctly as it would later be confirmed, resulted from a systemic error in how Vorthane sensor arrays compensated for a recent minor adjustment to the boundary corridor's official coordinates, an adjustment the compact had implemented 8 months earlier as part of routine navigational chart maintenance, and had, per standard protocol, formally notified Vorthane High Command about at the time, a notification that had, evidently, never been properly incorporated into the targeting software Calath's forward sensor teams were actually using. She cross-referenced that finding against a second, independent source before allowing herself to fully trust it, pulling the original 8-month-old boundary coordinate notification directly from Kest, Rel's own permanent transmission archive, confirming not only that the notification had been sent through proper channels at the time, but locating, with a small, grim satisfaction that did nothing to calm the growing urgency of her situation, the exact timestamp and confirmation receipt showing that Vorthane Systems had, in fact, formally acknowledged receipt of the update, a detail that meant the failure was not one of communication between the two governments, but of internal Vorthane process. The notification received and logged, but never actually propagated down into the operational targeting software actually used by forward patrol units. It was, she would later reflect, precisely the kind of gap her father had spent a childhood teaching her to watch for, the space between a message technically delivered and a message actually acted upon correctly by everyone downstream who needed it. She had, within the first 6 minutes of her 30-minute window, assembled what she believed was a clear, defensible technical case, that the strike order rested on outdated navigational data. What she did not yet have, and what she understood with a mounting dread that she later described as the worst feeling of her entire career, was any confidence that she would be able to get that case in front of anyone on the Vorthane side, with the authority to actually act on it within the roughly 24 minutes she now had left. Kestrel's watch commander that night was a Vorthane officer named Subcommander Yevrik Thas, one of the station's 20 Vorthane signals staff, a career military communications specialist who had, over 3 years of shared duty rotations, developed what Talia would later describe as a cordial but professionally cautious working relationship with her, the two of them competent colleagues rather than close friends. Shaped by an institutional wariness on both sides that 9 years of formal peace had softened without ever fully dissolving. Thas had joined the Vorthane Signals Corps in the war's final year, too young to have fought in its earlier, more brutal campaigns, and had built his own career almost entirely within the uneasy peace that followed, a background that had left him. Talia had noted over their years working together, somewhat less burdened by the deep, personally lived distrust that shaped officers of Calath's generation, though not, as the events of that night would ultimately reveal, entirely free of its influence either. Talia brought her findings to him within minutes of invoking the hold, understanding that whatever happened next would depend, in large part, on whether Thas was willing to stake his own considerable professional standing on the word of a compact counterpart, flagging what amounted to an accusation that Vorthane High Command had authorized a strike based on defective intelligence. She found him at his own console on the opposite side of the station's small command deck, and she remembered, with a clarity that had never faded in the years since, the specific effort it took to keep her voice level as she laid out, in the flattest, most procedurally neutral language she could manage, exactly what she had found and exactly what she believed it meant. Thas did not respond immediately when Talia laid out the navigational discrepancy, and she would later say that the 11 or 12 seconds of silence that followed, while he reviewed her data on his own console, felt considerably longer than the actual time that had passed. She watched him pull up the same navigational archive she had already reviewed 3 times, watched his eyes move across the discrepancy she had already committed to memory, 40 kilometers, a gap that seemed impossibly small measured against the vastness of the sector, and impossibly large measured against the 11,000 lives, now depending on whether he believed her. You are asking me to contact General Kalath's staff directly in the middle of the night and tell them their strike authorization is built on an error, Thas finally said. You understand what that costs me if you are wrong, and I want to be clear, Chief Rays, that I understand what it costs both of us, and quite possibly this entire station, if we are right and we hesitate anyway. I know, Talia said. I've checked this 3 times already, and I'll check it again while you make the call if that's what it takes. But we have maybe 20 minutes left before this order releases automatically, and I don't think either of us wants to be the person who decided a checked and rechecked 40-kilometer navigational discrepancy wasn't worth interrupting someone's night. Thas initiated a direct emergency contact request to 9th Border Fleet Command, a request that, under standard Vorthane military protocol, was required to be answered within 5 minutes for any communication flagged with the priority classification he assigned it. A classification reserved for exactly this kind of urgent operational discrepancy. The 5 minutes that followed, waiting for a response, stretched in Talia's memory into something considerably longer, the two of them sitting in a tense, largely silent vigil at opposite consoles, each running independent verification checks on the same data in the faint hope of finding some additional supporting detail before the response, whatever it turned out to be, finally arrived. The response, when it came, was not from General Kalath directly, but from a junior duty officer, who initially treated the inquiry with the kind of bureaucratic skepticism that Talia had feared, informing Thas that the strike order had been properly authorized through standard channels, and that a relay station's technical concerns about navigational data did not constitute grounds for interrupting an active military operation. Talia listened to the exchange over Thas's open channel, understanding enough of the clipped, formal Vorthane military phrasing to catch the duty officer's dismissive tone, even before Thas translated the full response for her benefit. And she felt, in that moment, the specific, sickening awareness that they now had perhaps 15 minutes remaining, and had just spent nearly a third of their available window on a response that had accomplished nothing. It was Thas, at that point, who made the decision that Talia would later credit as the single most consequential moment of the entire crisis, a decision that risked his own career, and standing within the Vorthane military hierarchy far more directly than anything Talia herself had done. He invoked, over the junior duty officer's continued objections, a rarely used provision of Vorthane military communications protocol allowing a relay verification hold to be escalated directly to a flag officer when the originating duty officer declined to engage substantively with a flagged technical discrepancy, a provision that required Thas to personally certify, under his own name and rank, that he believed the underlying discrepancy warranted General Kalath's direct, immediate attention, a certification that would follow him permanently in his service record regardless of how the situation ultimately resolved. I am certifying this escalation, Thas told the duty officer, in a recording that would later be reviewed extensively during the joint Vorthane Compact inquiry that followed the incident. If General Kalath wishes to overrule my judgment once he has actually reviewed the navigational data himself, that is his right as commanding officer, and I will accept full responsibility for having wasted his time. But I am not willing to let this order proceed to release without giving him that opportunity, and I am invoking my authority under Directive 7 to ensure he receives it. General Calath, roused from what limited rest a commanding officer managing an active strike authorization typically allowed himself, received the escalated report with 12 minutes remaining before the order's automated release. And the review that followed, conducted under an urgency that both Talia and Thas, monitoring the exchange from Kestrel, found almost unbearably tense to observe without any direct ability to influence its outcome, hinged entirely on whether Calath, a man whose deep institutional distrust of the compact had shaped an entire career, would be willing to seriously entertain the possibility that his own staff's intelligence analysis, built over a tense and anxious month of mounting suspicion, was simply wrong. Talia and Thas, unable to directly observe the review taking place aboard Calath's flagship, spent those 12 minutes monitoring what limited status updates the escalation channel provided, a series of terse, procedural notifications that gave almost no indication of how the review was actually proceeding, each one arriving at intervals that Talia would later describe as agonizingly slow. The two of them sitting together at Thas's console in a silence neither felt any particular need to fill, both understanding that there was nothing further either of them could do beyond wait and hope that the case they had assembled would prove sufficient. He was, in the end, willing, though not without a final, tense exchange that Talia would later say represented the single longest 4 minutes of her life. Calath's own staff, confronted directly with Kestrel's independent navigational tracking data and the specific, verifiable 8-month-old boundary coordinate notification that explained the exact source of their sensor error, conducted a rapid verification of their own targeting software's calibration, and confirmed, within minutes, that the 40-kilometer discrepancy Talia had identified was real, a straightforward technical error rather than any deliberate compact deception. An error that meant the convoy Meridian's promise had never, at any point, actually threatened to enter contested territory at all. General Calath issued a formal cancellation of the strike order at 4:09 station time, 6 minutes before its scheduled automated release, a cancellation that Talia processed through her own console with hands that had, by that point, stopped shaking entirely, replaced by an exhaustion so complete that she would later say she barely remembered the remainder of that overnight watch, functioning through the final hours on something closer to pure procedural muscle memory than any conscious, deliberate effort. She recalled, with unusual specificity given how little else of that final hour remained clear in her memory, the small, mundane detail of finally allowing herself a cup of the station's mediocre synthesized coffee sometime around dawn, an ordinary gesture that felt, in the moment, disproportionately significant, a quiet marker that the crisis had genuinely passed, and that the ordinary rhythms of a routine watch, however briefly, had reasserted themselves. The formal inquiry that followed, conducted jointly by Compact and Vorthane investigators over the following 6 weeks, examined every aspect of the incident with an exhaustive, occasionally uncomfortable thoroughness, reconstructing the exact sequence of the sensor calibration error, the intelligence assessment failures that had allowed a month of ambiguous reports to harden into a confident but mistaken conclusion, and the specific series of decisions, by Talia Reyes and Yevrik Thas in particular, that had ultimately prevented the error from becoming an irreversible catastrophe. The investigation itself proved, in its own way, an unusual model of the kind of cross-civilization cooperation both governments would later hold up as evidence that the threshold accords, whatever their flaws, had produced something genuinely durable. The Joint Investigative Team, comprising 11 compact and 9 Vorthane officers with no prior working relationship, spent the first several days of the inquiry establishing basic protocols for how the two sides would share sensitive intelligence and operational data with each other, a process that several participants later described as its own small negotiation, mirroring in miniature the larger diplomatic work that had produced the original Accords 9 years earlier. What ultimately made the investigation function, according to its senior compact co-chair, a veteran military analyst named Colonel Petru Adami, was less any formal protocol than a shared, sobering recognition among every investigator involved, regardless of which government they served, of exactly how close the incident had come to reigniting a war that neither side, whatever their lingering grievances, genuinely wanted to fight again. The inquiry's final report, released in a heavily redacted public version 6 months later, was notably candid, by the standards of such documents, about how narrowly disaster had been averted, concluding that absent Talia raises specific habit of closely reading routine traffic content rather than simply confirming successful transmission, and absent Yevrik Thas's willingness to risk his own career certifying an escalation over a subordinate's initial objection, the strike order would, in all likelihood, have reached the 9th Border Fleet's forward elements and been executed exactly as originally authorized, an outcome the report's authors, in language unusually blunt for an official joint inquiry document, described as having carried a near-certain probability of reigniting large-scale hostilities between the two civilizations, at a cost in both military and civilian casualties that this inquiry declines to estimate given the scale of speculation such an estimate would require. The report's authors devoted a full appendix, unusual for a document of its kind, specifically to what they termed the attention gap. A detailed analysis of how 9 years of relative peace had gradually eroded the operational seriousness with which both militaries treated the threshold Accord's joint relay requirement, tracing a clear, documented decline in staffing levels, training investment, and institutional prestige assigned to Kestrel across the full 9 years of its operation. A decline that had preceded, the appendix noted with evident concern, entirely without either government explicitly deciding to deprioritize the safeguard, simply through the accumulated, unexamined drift of countless smaller budgetary and staffing decisions, each individually reasonable but collectively producing an institution, far less capable of catching a genuine crisis than its original designers had intended. The immediate aftermath of the incident produced, within both governments, a wave of institutional reckoning considerably more serious than the quiet, backwater administrative role relay station Kestrel had occupied for its first 9 years of operation had ever suggested it might warrant. Compact Central Command, reviewing the incident alongside its Vorthane count. Urparts concluded that the near catastrophe had exposed a fundamental flaw in how both militaries had treated the threshold Accord's joint relay requirement, transforming what the original treaty negotiators had intended as a genuine, actively monitored safeguard against exactly this kind of misunderstanding into little more than a bureaucratic formality that both sides had, over 9 years of relative peace, allowed to atrophy into an under-resourced, under-respected posting considered, by most ambitious officers on either side, a career dead end rather than a position of genuine strategic significance. The initial public reaction, once a carefully redacted summary of the incident became known outside the small circle of officials directly involved, was considerably more volatile than either government's diplomatic corps had anticipated, particularly within compact colonial communities who reacted with understandable fury to the revelation that 11,000 civilians, including nearly 2,000 children, had come within minutes of being destroyed by an order built on a technical error that had gone uncorrected for 8 months. Compact Senate hearings held in the incident's immediate aftermath grew heated enough that several senior military officials, including 2 admirals who had overseen general force readiness along the border corridor, faced serious calls for resignation. Calls that ultimately did not result in formal removal, but that produced, according to internal Compact Defense Ministry records later made public, a substantial reorganization of how colonial trajectory data was cross-checked against border partner navigational systems going forward. On the Vorthane side, the political reckoning proved, if anything, more consequential, exposing publicly, for the first time in the 9 years since the Threshold Accords, the depth of the internal divide between the war generation's residual hardline instincts and the younger reformist officers who had spent nearly a decade arguing, with limited success, that the Directorate's military culture needed fundamental modernization if the peace was to survive its own founding generation's retirement. The incident became, almost overnight, the central rallying point for that reformist faction, providing concrete, undeniable evidence for an argument that had previously remained largely theoretical. That unexamined institutional distrust, however understandable given the war's legacy, carried a real and potentially catastrophic operational cost that could no longer be treated as an acceptable, unavoidable feature of the peace. The reforms that followed, negotiated over the following year in talks that both governments approached with a seriousness the original Threshold Accords negotiations had achieved only in their most contentious moments, substantially expanded relay station Kestrel's staffing, formal authority, and institutional standing within both military hierarchies, explicitly codifying and strengthening the verification hold provision that Talia had invoked under considerable personal risk, extending its maximum duration from 30 minutes to 2 hours, and establishing, for the first time, a formal joint command structure at Kestrel with genuine authority to independently investigate and, where necessary, indefinitely suspend military traffic that its own staff identified as resting on demonstrably outdated or conflicting operational data, rather than relying, as the original charter had, on the originating military command's voluntary cooperation with an inquiry it had every institutional incentive to dismiss. The negotiations were not without their own tensions, particularly around a compact proposal, ultimately adopted in modified form, to require mandatory quarterly cross-verification of all navigational and boundary coordinate data between the 2 militaries' independent systems, a provision several Vorthane negotiators initially resisted as an implicit accusation that Vorthane technical standards were inherently less reliable than the Compact's own. An objection that was eventually resolved by making the verification process fully symmetrical, requiring identical cross-checks running in both directions, a compromise that both sides, in later retrospective assessments, credited with catching at least 4 additional minor coordinate discrepancies in the years that followed, none individually as consequential as the error that had triggered the original crisis, but each one a quiet, unglamorous confirmation that the new system was working exactly as intended. Talia Reyes and Yevrik Thas were both, in the months following the inquiry's conclusion, offered accelerated promotions and reassignment to considerably more prestigious postings within their respective military hierarchies. Offers that both, independently and for reasons neither fully articulated to the other, until they compared notes on the matter years later at a commemorative event declined. Talia requested instead to remain at Kestrel and was ultimately appointed, as part of the broader reform package, to lead the station's newly formalized Joint Verification Division, a role that gave her exactly the kind of institutional authority and resources that her 3 years of quiet, careful, largely unheralded traffic monitoring had never previously carried, but that she insisted, in every interview she gave about the decision in the years that followed, was less important to her than the simple continuity of remaining in the specific role where she had learned, at considerable personal cost, exactly how much attention a routine-seeming posting actually demanded. The decision was not without its own personal costs. Talia's own family, watching from Ashgrove Reach as their daughter's name became, however briefly and however carefully redacted in public accounts, associated with one of the most consequential near-misses in the young piece's history, pressed her, in the months following the incident, to accept one of the more prestigious reassignment offers, arguing, not unreasonably, that she had more than earned the kind of career advancement that most signals officers spent entire careers hoping for. Her father, notably, was the one family member who did not press the point, telling her, in a conversation she recounted years later almost verbatim, that he understood better than anyone why she might want to stay exactly where she had learned the lesson that mattered most, and that he would support whatever decision she made, though he admitted, with the same wry honesty that had characterized his relay lessons throughout her childhood, that some part of him took a particular, quiet pride in watching his daughter choose the unglamorous, essential work over the more visible reward. "Everyone kept telling me this was my chance to move on to something bigger," she said, in an interview conducted 5 years after the incident for a joint compact Vorthane documentary marking the 10th anniversary of the Threshold Accords. "I understood why they thought that. But I'd spent 3 years learning exactly how much genuinely mattered in a job that everyone else treated as a formality, and I didn't want to hand that particular kind of attention off to someone who hadn't learned the same lesson the hard way I had. My father used to tell me the system will always tell you the message went through. It will never tell you whether the message made sense. I think that's true of entire institutions, not just individual relay stations." Kestrel had been telling both our governments for 9 years that the relay requirement was working, simply because messages kept successfully passing through it. Nobody was actually asking whether anyone on the other end was reading what those messages said. I didn't want to leave that job to someone else before I was certain the lesson had actually taken root. Yevrik Thas, for his part, remained at Kestrel as well, eventually rising to co-lead the Joint Verification Division alongside Talia in a partnership that both governments came to regard, over the following decade, as a model for exactly the kind of substantive, working-level cross-civilization cooperation that grander diplomatic gestures often struggled to achieve in practice. His own decision to remain drew less family pressure than Talia's had, but carried its own particular institutional risk, given that his certification of the emergency escalation, however ultimately vindicated, had briefly made him, in the eyes of some more traditionalist elements within Vorthane High Command, a figure whose willingness to challenge a senior general's judgment marked him as either admirably principled or dangerously insubordinate, depending entirely on which faction within the Directorate's ongoing political realignment happened to be assessing him. He would say, in his own reflections on the incident given during the same 10th anniversary documentary, that the moment which had actually cost him the most, in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, was not the risk of formally certifying an escalation against a junior duty officer's objection, a decision he described as difficult, but, in the final analysis, procedurally straightforward once he had genuinely reviewed Talia's evidence. It was, instead, the quieter, more personal reckoning of recognizing how close his own initial instinct toward institutional caution, his hesitation in that 11 or 12-second silence before he agreed to act, had come to costing 11,000 lives, a hesitation he understood, with the clarity only genuine crisis seemed able to produce, as itself a product of exactly the same kind of unexamined, accumulated distrust that had allowed General Calath's own staff to build a month of ambiguous censor reports into a confident case for war. I was not hesitating because I doubted Chief Ray's competence, Thass said. I had worked alongside her for 3 years by that point, and I respected her work considerably. I was hesitating because some old, unexamined part of me was asking whether a compact officer's urgent warning about a Vorthane targeting error could be trusted at face value. A question I would like to say I would never have asked myself about a Vorthane colleague making the identical claim. I have thought about those 11 seconds many times in the years since, and I have come to believe that the actual lesson of that night was not really about sensor calibration or communications protocol at all. It was about how much unexamined suspicion two supposedly peaceful civilizations can still carry toward each other, 9 years after a war formally ended, and how close that residual suspicion came, in my own particular case, to costing far more than any calibration error alone ever could have. General Calath's own career did not survive the incident in any conventional sense, though the resolution, when it came, proved considerably more complicated and, in its own way, more hopeful than a simple disciplinary dismissal might have been. The formal inquiry, while identifying serious failures in how his staff had assembled and validated their month-long intelligence assessment, stopped short of characterizing Calath's own conduct, once presented with Kestrel's evidence, as anything other than appropriately responsive, noting specifically that he had canceled the strike order within minutes of receiving credible evidence that it rested on faulty data, a decision the inquiry credited as having required, from a commander of his generation and his documented institutional distrust of the compact, a genuine and difficult act of open-minded reconsideration under enormous time pressure. The 4 minutes between Calath's receipt of the escalated report and his formal cancellation of the strike order became, in the inquiry's detailed reconstruction, a subject of particular scrutiny, not because investigators doubted the outcome, but because they wished to understand precisely what had allowed a man whose entire career had been shaped by hostility toward the compact to overcome that hostility quickly enough to matter. The reconstructed timeline showed Calath spending the first 90 seconds in near-total silence, reviewing Kestrel's navigational data alongside his own staff's original targeting analysis side by side on his command console, before asking a single question of his senior intelligence officer, preserved in the recording later reviewed by investigators. Whether the 8-month-old compact boundary notification, the one whose absence from Vorthane targeting software had produced the entire error, had in fact been received and logged by Vorthane systems at the time. His staff's confirmation that it had, that the notification existed in Vorthane records, but had simply never been properly incorporated into the forward sensor team's active targeting calibration, appeared, according to the inquiry's account, to have been the decisive moment, the point at which Calath's own residual suspicion of compact deception gave way to the plainer, more uncomfortable recognition that his own side's internal process, not any compact provocation, was responsible for what had very nearly happened. Calath was reassigned, in the reform package's aftermath, away from active field command and into a newly created advisory role focused specifically on modernizing Vorthane sensor calibration and intelligence verification standards across the border fleet, a role that he approached, according to colleagues who worked with him in the years that followed, with a seriousness and personal investment that surprised officers who had expected the reassignment to function as little more than a face-saving demotion. He spent much of his first year in the new role personally reviewing the technical calibration standards of every forward sensor team along the 9th Border Fleet's patrol routes, a level of hands-on involvement that several of his former staff officers, accustomed to his more traditional command style, found initially unexpected, and that Calath himself, in later interviews, attributed directly to a determination that no future commander under his authority would ever again be placed in the position his own staff's uncorrected error had placed him. He met Talia Reyes in person for the first time roughly 18 months after the incident, at a joint Vorthang Compact technical conference on sensor calibration standards that had been established directly in response to the inquiry's recommendations, an encounter that neither had specifically sought out, but that both later described, separately, as unexpectedly significant. Calath, according to Talia's own account of the meeting, approached her directly during a conference reception, introduced himself formally, and offered what she described as the most genuinely difficult apology she had ever witnessed a senior military officer deliver, an acknowledgement, delivered without any of the careful diplomatic hedging such statements typically carried, that his own accumulated distrust of the compact, built over a career shaped by the war that had preceded the Threshold Accords, had nearly cost 11,000 lives, and that he understood, having reviewed the full inquiry record in exhaustive detail, that the only reason it had not was the specific, careful attention of a relay officer, whose job his own institutional culture had spent 9 years treating as beneath serious consideration. "I do not offer this apology because it changes what nearly happened," Calath told her, in a conversation Talia later recounted for the documentary crew with evident emotion despite the years that had passed. "I offer it because I have spent 18 months understanding exactly how much my own unexamined certainty nearly cost, and because I think the only honest response to that understanding is to say so plainly, to the person whose careful attention prevented my error from becoming an irreversible catastrophe, rather than allowing the inquiry's careful, procedural language to stand in for what actually needs to be said between us directly." Talia, by her own account, had not fully known how to respond in the moment, and admitted, in later reflections on the encounter, that she had spent much of the intervening 18 months assuming, without much specific thought to the matter, that General Calath remained, somewhere within the Vorthane command structure, an unrepentant symbol of exactly the kind of institutional distrust that had nearly gotten her convoy's 11,000 passengers killed. Meeting him in person and hearing an apology she had not expected and had not particularly sought complicated that assumption in ways she said she was still, years later, working through. "I don't think one conversation erases what nearly happened," she said, But I also don't think it costs anything to believe him when he says he's spent 18 months genuinely trying to understand his own mistake. That's more than a lot of people manage, on either side of a war like the one that shaped him. The reformed relay station Kestrel, restructured and substantially expanded in the years following the incident, became, within a decade, one of the most closely studied and eventually most emulated joint military institutions in the ongoing Vorthing Compact relationship. Its verification protocols adapted and implemented at 3 additional joint monitoring facilities, established along other contested border regions in the years that followed. Each one built explicitly on the lesson that both governments had, by that point, come to accept as the incident's central and most durable finding. That peace, once negotiated, did not maintain itself automatically through the simple continued existence of a treaty document, but required the same kind of careful, sustained, unglamorous attention that Talia Reyes' father had once tried to teach a young daughter trailing him through the aging relay infrastructure of a quiet agricultural world. The patient, unglamorous discipline of actually reading the traffic, rather than simply trusting that a message's successful transmission meant the message itself had been understood correctly by everyone whose job it was to receive it. The 3 additional facilities, established over the following 8 years along other sections of the demilitarized corridor, and eventually, along a 4th border shared between the compact and an entirely separate power with whom relations had grown similarly strained in the years following the Kestrel incident. Each adopted variations of the verification hold protocol that Talia and Thas had in effect, improvised under extraordinary pressure that first night. Now formalized into a standard training curriculum taught at joint compact Vorthing instructional academies, established specifically for that purpose. Talia herself, alongside Thas, spent a portion of nearly every year for the following decade traveling to those facilities personally, training incoming verification staff not merely in the technical mechanics of the protocol, but in the underlying discipline that had made it work in the first place, insisting, in every training session she led, that the protocol itself was only ever as reliable as the attention of the individual officer actually watching the traffic pass through it. Talia kept, for the remainder of her long career at Kestrel, a small handwritten note her father had sent her shortly after the incident became public, a note she had framed and kept on her console for every subsequent watch rotation she stood, and that she would eventually pass on, according to a tradition that grew up informally among Kestrel's expanded verification staff in the years that followed, to every new officer who joined the division she had helped build. The note read simply, "I always told you the system would never tell you whether the message made sense. I am glad, more than I can say in words, that you were listening closely enough that night to notice when it didn't." He had, she would later learn, written the note before he fully understood the scale of what his daughter had actually prevented. Working only from the carefully vague, security-conscious account she had been permitted to give him in the immediate aftermath, and she found something quietly moving in the years that followed in the fact that his pride in her had required no fuller accounting of the stakes involved, that the habit itself, the simple discipline of reading the traffic carefully, had been enough. In his estimation, to be worth writing down and worth remembering, regardless of how dramatically or quietly it ultimately mattered. That, more than any formal commendation or any line in an official inquiry report, is the reason the story of those 11 minutes is still told, across both Vorthing and compact training academies, not primarily as a tale of averted catastrophe, though it was certainly that, but as a quieter and more enduring lesson about the specific, unglamorous kind of vigilance that peace between two civilizations actually requires long after the treaties are signed and the formal ceremonies concluded. The willingness of one tired, overworked officer on an unremarkable overnight watch to actually read what was passing in front of her, rather than simply confirming, as the system itself would have been perfectly content to let her do, that the message had gone through.